our webinar this morning. Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office and the Hans Seidel Foundation are co-hosting this discussion. And we're looking at the Zondo Commission and what has happened to all of its recommendations. It's now a year and 2 months, more or less, since Chief Justice Zondo handed over the long report of his commission after more than 3 years of taking evidence, 300 witnesses, expenditure of over R1 billion, and 350 odd recommendations were made across the spectrum, trying to deal with this age that we live through of state capture. On the anniversary of the handover, the Chief Justice himself said at a speech at an event organized by the Human Sciences Research Council that if someone were to try state capture again, it might well work because, in his view, Parliament in particular had done very little, if anything, to strengthen its oversight capacities to prevent such a thing from happening again. And that's really one of the things we want to explore this morning. Not only Parliament, but there will be a certain focus on Parliament, as well as within the wider context of other recommendations. So we have three speakers. First of all, Gary Pienaar, who is with the Human Sciences Research Council as a senior researcher, will give us quite a thorough and comprehensive presentation, which I've already had the privilege of looking at, that covers a lot of the different areas of what Chief Justice Zondo investigated and made recommendations on. And then that'll be followed by two shorter inputs, responses as it were, one from Sabelo Ndlovu, who is with the Parliamentary Monitoring Group and who has himself zeroed in on what the Zondo Commission report said about Parliament and Parliament's response or lack thereof to date. And then our old friend, Steve Swart, ACDP MP, who has been with us on numerous occasions over the years, one of the most senior members of Parliament, and someone who, as a member of the Justice Portfolio Committee, has been very intimately involved in, assessing these recommendations and their constitutional implications, etc. And Steve will give us a perspective from within Parliament as an MP. I guess sometimes those of us on the outside in the NGO civil society world find it quite easy to criticize and pass judgment. And sometimes we need to just say, well, what's it like on the inside? What are some of the difficulties, the constraints that the institution faces? So I'm going to now hand over to Gary for the first presentation. Gary, would you like to start sharing your screen?
Good morning, Mike, and good morning to everyone online. Thank you very much for the invitation to share this presentation. It was initially developed for purposes of the colloquium on the first anniversary of the handing over of the report by the Chief Justice. But I've updated it a bit based on subsequent developments, and it's pleasing to note that there have been subsequent developments. So this is an ongoing process. And I'm taking a view here mainly from an institutional perspective. So it's limited, of course. There were over 200 recommendations, and we can't do justice to all of those. So it will be necessarily limited. But yes, these are just then some highlights, so to speak, and a few lowlights, unfortunately. But this is a work in progress, and we live in hope that progress will continue to be made. So I think just like to mention this. I think your viewers will probably recognize one of the 7 deadly sins here. And one of America's founding fathers, even at the birth of a nation that was filled with hope and optimism, nevertheless recognized that there are dangers that face every country. And I think greed is really what characterized state capture. And it's the nature of humanity, but also the nature of our society at the moment. I think that we need to realize that we can't just focus on the institutional reforms that will be the focus of this presentation, but I think the character of the people in our society and those that we choose to lead us that will ultimately, I think, make all the difference.
Gary, I'm sorry. I don't think
Yes.
you're in slide mode, are you? It would.
I'm sorry. I thought I had put us in slide mode. I beg your pardon. Let me do that. Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. My apologies. So some of the key findings and recommendations by the Zondo Commission were that there were certain prominent elements or features of state capture that enabled it to succeed. And the following are those that I've tried to highlight. The strategic positioning of politically connected individuals in positions of power through the abuse of appointment and dismissal processes. This positioning was used to control and manipulate public procurement and financial and contracting processes in state-owned enterprises and in the public sector more widely, and specifically for private gain. Many of your viewers will recognize that's a paraphrase of a common description or definition of corruption. And it was bolstered by further strategic appointments of individuals in positions of power, particularly in law enforcement and tax administration, to ensure protection from sanction or consequences by those involved in state capture, both in the private sector and in the public sector. So it was this ability to place politically connected people on boards and in key senior management positions within the public administration and SOEs that the Zondo Commission characterized as the essential mechanism of state capture. And that distinguishes our form of state capture in South Africa from other forms elsewhere, particularly in the post-Soviet era in Russia. And a significant enabling factor in this process was the failure to implement existing provisions in Section 195 of the Constitution, which doesn't just envisage, but requires public administration to be professional, effective, impartial, and developmental in objective, and not assume the form of an extractive state, which is really what happened here. So there were these many dubious appointments in key positions. To enable that to happen, many experienced and honest officials had to be ousted or formally dismissed to make way for those who were the enablers and facilitators within the state. And there were no effective mechanisms to prevent cronyism and what the Commission found to be unlawful and unconstitutional cadre deployment from continuing to dominate appointments to boards and to senior executive officers, both in SOEs and elsewhere in the state. There was a lack of compliance, a lack of transparency, and a lack of accountability among those in these senior positions that enabled the capture of SOEs, and of course what enabled their capture was the positioning of these individuals within the state departments as well. And as a result, the Commission made a couple of key recommendations. The one is a truly independent and transparent appointments process, free from political manipulation, so that ultimate appointments made by a minister, whether it's to an SOE or in a department, is genuinely the result of a merit-based selection process. And secondly, the establishment of a standing appointment and an oversight committee through public hearings to ensure that any nominee for board appointment or as a CEO, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Procurement Officer of an SOE meets particular professional, reputational, and eligibility requirements for that position. Just a recent update to that, in the President's weekly letter of the 14th of August, he said a forthcoming SOE bill will improve SOE oversight, transparency, and accountability. Didn't spell out any details, didn't say whether those improvements will meet the targets or the standards identified in the recommendations. So we'll have to watch this space, among others. When it comes to financial management and audit reforms, the Commission also recommended that the Auditor General or only auditors who demonstrate the requisite capacity should audit SOEs. So no longer allowing SOEs free rein to appoint their own auditors. We know that there were many enablers of state capture. Some of them were auditors, some of them were lawyers who did not meet the professional standards of competence and ethics. And they either did not see, or when they did see, looked away when irregularities should have shown themselves during the auditing process. And so it was only afterwards that these irregularities and maladministration emerged, often too late to stop the rot and to stop the bleeding of public finances. And then the Commission also recommended a return to the original intent of the PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act, to let public sector managers manage and hold them accountable, nevertheless. So this is something we'll dig into a little bit deeper later on. But there was also a call to protect these accounting officers. So that's directors general and other senior managers in SOEs, who are, sometimes in SOEs, they will be the people who account to boards, sometimes it'll be the boards themselves, but to protect them from criminal or civil liability for actions in good faith and that are not negligent. So in other words, allowing a little bit more flexibility in financial management and in procurement, but nevertheless holding them accountable where they are negligent and where they're not acting in good faith. There were, of course, many of you will be aware that there have been complaints over a number of years that the PFMA is too restrictive. It doesn't let managers manage effectively. There's a compliance approach rather than an outcomes approach to public management. And that really doesn't, it constrains effective delivery of services and procurement of goods and services. So this was an attempt to ameliorate those constraints. And some of the little ticks here are indications of some progress towards implementing recommendations. So these are not necessarily full compliance yet, but they are markers or signposts, I think, of progress along that road. The Auditor General has said that they are reviewing the usefulness of the concept of irregular expenditure, which is one of those very, very tight and narrow constraints that is meant to prevent irregularities and maladministration. And I think it's worthwhile pointing out here that the tight constraints here are because I think we've shown as a country that many of us are not capable of self-governance. And so we have to be governed externally through regulation, oversight. And so I think we've brought upon ourselves the level of regulation, the level of red tape that is often complained of. But you'll often hear some senior managers say, look, we've had clean audits for so many years, we've proven ourselves capable of effective governance and service delivery. We think we should be given a little bit of latitude here. So the Auditor General is looking into that possibility, with instead looking to identify corrupt or suspicious expenditure or expenditure incurred in bad faith, rather than this tight and narrow one-size-fits-all approach. There's also the signs of a clearer delegation of administrative and financial responsibilities to accounting officers like DGs and their deputies in the Public Service Amendment Bill that is currently before Parliament. One of the other key areas of focus of the Commission was that this how do we address this problem of the ability to just simply put people in power by abusing public sector appointment and dismissal processes. And one of the recommendations was that executive authorities, and that means political appointees, or nominees, such as ministers, MECs, premiers, the president. So essentially cabinets, and then also the same at municipal level, mayors, etc., should not be involved in the operational and administrative matters in their sphere of government. That should be the responsibility of accounting officers. And so there should be this depoliticization of the political administrative interface. And one of the ways to do this is clear delegations of authorities to accounting officers, allowing them that latitude. There should not be political interference with their responsibilities. They should be seen as professional public servants. They should be free to execute their mandates, to pursue their job descriptions without undue interference. There should be some safeguards along the way. There should be regular ethics and governance training, for example, by the National School of Government and the Public Service Commission for all public representatives and public servants, to ensure that both sides understand what is expected of them, what are the limits of their authority, that there is still an accountability relationship between AOs and EAs, but just to take the heat out of that interface. And then regular integrity testing, so that to ensure that people understand in practice what these boundaries mean for them in practice, and what are the ethics considerations surrounding that. One of the progress markers identified is that lifestyle audits have started, and that psychometric integrity testing is under development by the DPSA. Professionalizing the public administration doesn't seem as though it's going to be a smooth road, however. Last year in October, Cabinet adopted and approved a national framework for the professionalization of the public sector. This is progress, moving on from the initial conceptualization of it that was just disseminated for comment, which was the professionalization of the public service. So this will include a number of public entities identified in the PFMA, and it doesn't include SOEs, but it is broader than just the public service, and ultimately it will include local government when they are included in the public service. However, shortly after that, in the ANC's policy and elective conference in December last year, the ANC retained cadre deployment as official party policy. So it seems as though there will still be an element of conflict that will bedevil how easily or not, or how effectively or how thoroughly professionalization may ensue. Now, there are a couple of important signals here that the Public Administration Management Amendment Bill has been tabled in Parliament. That will allow, among other things, local government to be included in the public sector and in the public service more specifically. The Public Service Amendment Bill, similarly, it will apply to local government, and it also introduces an important ethics considerations, and I'll deal with those a little bit later. But one thing that a key amendment bill that has not yet been introduced into Parliament is the Public Service Commission Amendment Bill. Now, this has been knocking around for about 8 years, and this is intended to allow the Public Service Commission to be recognized fully as a constitutional entity, so that the office of the Public Service Commission is not any longer a government department, which it is at the moment, which confuses its role and the way that the Public Service Commission is perceived, and it undermines its responsibility and its authority as a constitutional body. And it's vital that this amendment bill is tabled and then passed, because it is intended to enable, in terms of this professionalization framework, intended to enable the Public Service Commission to oversee and manage the process of recruiting and appointing on merit senior public servants and others in the public sector. And if this is delayed too much longer, there really is no prospect of it being passed before next year's elections. And I think that is the concern here, is that this key requirement will not be in place to professionalize the public sector. This framework for the public sector, for professionalizing the public sector, um, requires this independent public service commission to ensure that merit is the overriding criterion. However, one or two features have already been implemented, and that is there has been the appointment of a new head of the public administration, and that is the DG in the presidency and the premier in the provinces. And they are now responsible for the career incidents, as it's called, for the recruitment, promotion, and dismissal of public servants. So this includes DGs and downwards, DDGs, etc., and HODs in the provinces and municipal managers in future when they are part of the public sector and public service. And it will no longer be the MEC or a minister that will have that power. So it does address this political administrative interface and ensures that these senior public servants will have a little bit more protection and allow them to do their jobs without political interference. There are also in the legislation, the PAMA and the Public Service Amendment Bill, clear delegations of administrative and financial functions from executive authorities or ministers and MECs to accounting officers. And also the employees who report to them and AOs themselves will be prohibited from holding senior office in a political party. So that depoliticizes, again, that political administrative interface. And there will also be a prohibition on any business with the state among those senior public servants. And if you're involved in procurement, you will also be required to undergo a cooling off period. At the moment, it's proposed of 1 year before you may leave the state and then join somebody who has been a bidder or a successful service provider to the state. So that long called for cooling off period is now envisaged in the legislation. So I think that's an important marker of potential progress if it's adopted. Of course, the Commission recommended a number of steps of consequence management, disciplinary processes and legal processes such as criminal prosecution in several instances that has started. Sabelo will speak about some of this in Parliament, but we have seen the start, even before the Commission's recommendations, of compulsory lifestyle audits for senior management. We've seen it also in Eskom, but as of the 31st of March this year, not all national and provincial departments were actually implementing those lifestyle audits, and they hadn't all yet been completed. When it comes to collaboration between the NPA and the Hawks in terms of prosecutions, they have established an integrated task force to more effectively coordinate their investigations and prosecutions. So this is not yet one of the other key recommendations, which is an independent anti-corruption agency, but we are seeing at least some coordination. It's not yet the Scorpions of old, but it is some level of coordination. President Ramaphosa, in his letter from the president, again on the 14th of August, claimed significant progress, in his words, in recovering the proceeds of crime. He mentioned freezing orders and recoveries of 5.4 billion, and that SARS has collected unpaid taxes. He didn't put a figure on that, but progress at least is being made, it seems. The other major challenge identified by the Commission is that there is currently no centralized register of employees who are facing disciplinary proceedings, perhaps whether it's been implemented or it's pending, but then they resign before proceedings either commence or conclude. And there's no centralized register that covers the public service as it is now and includes local government and includes public entities, including SOEs, so that there's tracking across the state, across the public sector, of where those people go after they resign. So, for example, they could resign from a government department and just join an SOE, and there would be no sort of red flag raised to prevent their re-employment if they resign under a cloud without these matters being resolved or finalized. And so there is an intention to develop this tracking mechanism. It was due to be rolled out and started with effect from April this year. I couldn't find any evidence of progress. And the president didn't mention it in his letter. And there may be, this may be happening, but I was not able to find out any evidence of it. When it comes to this recommended permanent anti-corruption agency, it has been indicated both by the president and by the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. They have said that this issue is on their agenda. We don't yet know whether they will meet the STIRS criteria that the Constitutional Court said in the second Glenister judgment is required of a truly independent anti-corruption agency and an effective one. So the STIRS criteria indicate that they have specialized skills, that they are trained in those skills, that they really are independent, they are well and adequately resourced, and that their positions are secure. So if we look at, in the meantime, what we have is that the president recently announced, the cabinet recently approved the independent directorate within the NPA being made permanent. Even if that is made permanent, they are not really going to meet those 5 criteria fully. But at least that is an element of permanence that will allow the investigating directorate to attract the kind of skills that has been lacking. So the fact that they are permanent, I think, would help them to address that skills gap that has seen a number of failures of some high-profile prosecutions at the early stages. And that's been a disappointment for everybody who's been watching that. So we do hope that this permanence will enable them to attract more and better skilled staff and qualified prosecutors. And the other key point to mention here is that the ID will be given stronger investigative powers. Details I'm not clear of at this stage, but that's at least promising, but that still doesn't necessarily meet those 5 criteria the Constitutional Court has set out. Sorry, I think this is a duplicate slide. I beg your pardon. So the other key problem identified by the Commission is that premiers are responsible for the actions and failures of MECs, and the president is equally responsible for the actions and failures of ministers, and that while there is an accountability a relationship here, it's currently without adequate sanction, it seems. Removal or dismissal sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. We see that a number of people who have been implicated by the Zondo Commission merely are moved sideways. And so performance agreements aren't really adequate as a tool. That for the moment is the only other instrument available to the president or the premiers. And dismissal is not really adequately enforced. And sometimes also ministers are not just moved sideways, but they do find their way into the ruling party's executive committee. And so they still have a role and an influential role to play. And so the Commission identified that there are basic standards identified for members of the executive in their solemn oath or affirmation that they take on assumption of office. They're also, when they are members of the executive, bound by the Executive Ethics Code in terms of the Executive Ethics Act. But it seems as though those have not been enough to prevent misconduct and abuse of authority. And therefore, the Commission recommended a new offense, a criminal offense of power abuse, so that it would be an offense for any person vested with public power to abuse their political power by intentionally using that power otherwise than in good faith or for a proper purpose. Now, President Ramaphosa's letter again recently said this is being studied, and this is the first we hear that this is being looked into. So it's really, it's a concern that it's taken more than a year for at least to indicate what action is being taken. And it seems as though this is really at an early stage still. And it's also not clear about the other criminal offence recommended by the Commission, which is to ensure that public representatives fulfill their obligations by introducing a criminal sanction for a form of constitutional or political malpractice. The extent to which this may or may not overlap with the previous recommended criminal offence is not clear. I haven't seen or haven't been aware of any research undertaken here. The President didn't mention this, and so it's not clear what action is being taken here, and really to what extent these might be different offences. When it comes to parliamentary oversight in the electoral system, the Commission found that in several instances, Parliament was not effective in holding the executive to account. It was only really belatedly in 2017 that we had a portfolio committee or a committee established to look at Eskom, but its recommendations and findings didn't really go anywhere. And so the Commission recommended changes to the electoral system, perceiving or finding that Parliament really had not been effective, and the way Parliament is structured needs to be revisited. And so it recommended changes to the electoral system. It recommended a constituency-based system, which would enhance the capacity of members of Parliament to hold the executive accountable, but by making them more accountable to their constituencies than to the party that puts them on their lists. But when we see the Electoral Amendment Act that was adopted and promulgated in 2023, Parliament essentially ignored these recommendations. The Commission also recommended that Parliament should consider legislation to protect MPs from undue influence and protect their party membership just because they exercised their oversight responsibilities in good faith. The Speaker's response has been that the Constitution and the parliamentary protection and privileges and immunities for Parliament and Provincial Legislatures Act provide adequate protection. Now, we know that both the Constitution and PIPLA existed during state capture, and that did not really provide MPs with any sense of independence. They certainly did not act in an independent way when it came to, for example, Nkandla. They have not acted in an independent way when it comes to Phala. So then and now, it seems as though majority vote is what counts rather than independent active thinking and actions by members of Parliament. When it comes to the presidency, it was recommended that Parliament should establish an oversight committee for the President and the presidency. All we've seen is that a study tour was planned for July 2023 to consider international comparative models. We don't yet know, and I suppose we may see a report when Parliament reconvenes after the recess. It was also recommended that more opposition party reps should chair portfolio committees. This was simply rejected by Parliament. There were recommendations for public procurement reform. It was noted that the public procurement system was the primary site for the diversion of state resources for private interest. There were a number of recommendations made, a national charter, a code of conduct, both of which should be legislated. Every public procurement officer should sign and observe and uphold this national charter, as should every bidder and contractor and everybody who might be involved in this process, including public representatives and public officials. There should be the creation of a public procurement officer's profession so that there's a professional body that, in addition to legislation, could and ethics could hold these officials accountable, such as with auditors and with the legal professionals, although we know there were weaknesses in those two professions, and I'll come to that a little bit later. This professional body should also determine qualifications, training, and experience necessary for membership of the profession, and therefore as appointment in the public sector. And that every procurement system and every procuring entity should appoint only duly qualified members in good standing. The Commission also recommended an independent public procurement anti-corruption agency, so a specialized agency independent from the Permanent Anti-Corruption Commission, as the Commission recommended. It's not clear whether this is also on NECAC's agenda, but they may be considering these agencies, or this agency, in addition to the Permanent Commission or Anti-Corruption Agency. Other reforms recommended is that we should adhere to the OECD principles for transparency and integrity in public procurement, and that this should be there should be legislation for greater centralization and harmonization of aspects of procurement that currently are very decentralized and are currently very uneven. And so the Commission found that really there are untrained, unqualified people interpreting these standards and applying them in very different ways. And that has contributed to some of the maladministration in public procurement. The public procurement bill that has been introduced into Parliament has been severely criticized as weak and really inadequate. The Commission also recommended stronger protection for whistleblowers. The DOJ just in July released a discussion paper on whistleblower protection. It has recommended a couple of interesting changes and improvements, that the narrow definition of occupational detriment, so in other words, any detriment to people in the context of their employment, so that really protects only people who are blowing the whistle in relation to maladministration or irregularities or possible corruption in their employment location or milieu. That definition is proposed to be expanded to any detrimental action. So this will include anybody outside of an employment context. So it would include, I beg your pardon, contractors. It would include journalists. It would include any member of the public would be protected from detrimental action if they were to blow the whistle, if they were aware of any kind of maladministration or corruption, and they reported that. There would also be the establishment of a protection fund, a legal defense fund, and the possibility of rewards for whistleblowers. President Ramaphosa, in his letter of the 14th of August, mentioned criminalizing threats against whistleblowers. This is not specifically recommended in the discussion paper, although there is mention in the discussion paper of provisions in the Companies Act and the Harassment Act, which are on the books, which do provide some protection for harassment. So you can take out a protection order if you are harassed as a result of blowing the whistle. So there are some protections, and I think the question here is, are those protections going to be improved and enhanced? There are some positive signs, though, in this discussion paper. And I think on the 15th of July, submissions closed in this discussion paper. The Commission report also found that private companies and professional service firms like auditors and lawyers had also engaged in corruption to secure state contracts. And we all know about Bain and Consulting. We all know about the auditors and the lawyers who were complicit in these activities. And this was as a result of a failure to enforce procurement and anti-corruption laws, as well as a failure in professional ethics. And a key, I think, improvement, and I think a dramatic improvement, is that the Auditing Professions Act, which is under the auspices of the Independent Regulatory Authority and Board for Auditors, now includes a fine of up to 25 million rand per offence of improper conduct for auditors who do not comply with the standards expected of them. And this is an increase from a couple of 100,000 rand, which was the maximum. So this is a dramatic disincentive for any kind of improper conduct, and I think that's to be welcomed. The willingness of IRBA to enforce that, I think, is the next thing to watch. When do we see this being enforced? And obviously it's up to a maximum, so a lower sanction is also possible in terms of this new legislation. Another recommendation was to amend the Companies Act to allow directors to be declared delinquent much earlier on, within 2 years. We haven't seen that yet. There's nothing I could see on PMG to indicate that anything like this has been tabled in Parliament. There should be a stronger duty on private sector entities to prevent bribery, and PRECCA, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, should make it a criminal offence for anybody in the private sector or in an SOE to fail to prevent bribery. Now, in the Judicial Matters Amendment Bill tabled in Parliament, there is a proposal to make it an offence to take reasonable or adequate measures to prevent the offer of, or the giving or promising or giving and receiving of gratification. So there is something on the books, it seems, or on the table at least, that might find its way onto the books. And then there's also a recommendation for the Political Party Funding Act to include a provision to criminalize donations to political parties in the expectation of a quid pro quo for being granted a contract, a tender contract. Nothing like that, it appears, has been considered. Just some concluding remarks. Obviously, anti-corruption strategies have been in place for many years. It's clear from the findings and recommendations that these were inadequate and more needs to be done. Recommendations by the Commission, therefore, must be seen to be implemented. And it really was in June at the colloquium with the Chief Justice, it really was not clear how much was being done. Since then, as I've tried to indicate in this presentation, there are some signs that action is being taken. When the Chief Justice made his critical remarks of Parliament, and he at the colloquium, and he said that he wasn't confident that Parliament was in any better position to prevent state capture, and there was an outcry from Parliament. There was a subsequent meeting between Parliament and the Chief Justice. It appears that since then there has been more reporting on by Parliament itself. There was a media conference. The President has now, just in the last few weeks, given a little bit more of an update about what's going on behind the scenes. Obviously, one can see certain bills being introduced into Parliament, but some of the critical bills are not yet there, and they do need to be seen to be implemented, not just be tabled for discussion, but being adopted and implemented. And one of those key pieces of legislation, of course, is what the Public Service Commission Amendment Bill that really has been talked about for a long time, and it's really not clear why it's not yet tabled in Parliament, and we are running out of time. So reporting on progress, perhaps a few signs about improvement, but there are signs, and there were signs in my colleagues' presentation, my colleagues who run the South African Social Attitudes Survey, that voters are losing patience with democracy. There's increasing mistrust in the institutions of the state and in democracy itself. We've seen that reflected in lower voter turnout, and the IEC, I know, is extremely concerned about low voter turnout in 2024, which could undermine our democratic legitimacy. And then if that happens, a lot is up for grabs. And I think those are some of the real concerns that face us right now. Thank you very much. I hope I've kept to some degree of timekeeping. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, colleagues.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. As I said earlier, it is such a comprehensive overview. We're all in your debt for the research that you've done there, putting all of these different strands together. Encouraging to see that there are indeed some ticks down on the left-hand side, more perhaps than some people might have thought there would be. And also encouraging to hear you say that since the one-year anniversary in the colloquium that you held with the Chief Justice, there have been even further steps towards some degree of progress. So long way to go, but yeah, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm now going to ask Sabelo Ndlovu to start sharing his screen and to take us into a little bit more detail as regards Parliament's response, or what the recommendations were regarding Parliament and Parliament's response to date. Sabelo, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Mike, for inviting us to this event. And thank you, Mike. Thank you, Gary, for the comprehensive and very useful presentation. Is my screen showing?
It is. If you just put it into slideshow mode, then it'll
Okay,
be better.
Sure. Okay.
That's
Thank you.
the one.
Perfect. Yeah. So just an overview. So as PMG, we monitor the work of Parliament to enable all sectors of society to take part in policy and lawmaking processes. So we in June, 2 months back, we published a review or write-up in collaboration with the Institute for African Alternatives, where we reviewed Parliament's processing of the state capture report. So my presentation today flows from that write-up and also incorporates all the updates that we've received, be it from Parliament itself, from the presidency, and in relation to the processing of the Zondo Commission report. So yeah, this is just the first slide will just be an overview of what we do as PMG, which I won't delve much into. And then, yes, I also indicated that, yes, in June, we published a review and gave an account of what Parliament has done since Chief Justice Zondo released his findings and recommendations. And also we went beyond that by also presenting our views on how the institution can strengthen its oversight processes, specifically relating those related to the committee system. So just an overview of what Chief Justice Zondo said in his report. He put forward that weaknesses in Parliament, in parliamentary oversight and executive accountability had over time contributed to corruption and maladministration, and recommended that Parliament consider reforms to improve its oversight and this accountability function. And then flowing from that, there were 10 key recommendations that Chief Justice Zondo gave, which were disaggregated up to 19, and to include the 3 relating to the legislation and work of the Committee on Ethics and Members' Interest. I think Gary touched on some of those recommendations in his presentation. So some of these recommendations included procedures concerned with House resolutions emanating from oversight activities, executive reports and submission to Parliament, and establishment of an oversight committee over the presidency, and the appointment of opposition committee chairpersons. So we note that even before the release of the final parts of the Commission's report in June 2022, there was pressure on Parliament from the opposition, civil society, and others for Parliament to urgently deal with the Commission's recommendations. At that time, Parliament even received legal advice to say nothing stops MPs from processing the State Capture Commission reports, especially the sections pertaining to the institution and this oversight role, because initially Parliament expressed the views that they should wait for the president to first submit his implementation plan before they could commence their work in relation to the processing of the recommendations. So the president then submitted his implementation plan in October 2022, and then the next month in November of the Zondo report. This was 5 months after the report was published. So in November 2022, the NA Rules Committee, the National Assembly's Rules Committee, convened and adopted the 31-page implementation plan to deal with the Commission's recommendations. And then as a means of ensuring that the recommendations achieve the required outcomes, structures were identified that must report quarterly to the House chairpersons of committee in both houses. So the next slide is just an overview of some of the structures and the key recommendations that are being dealt with by those various structures. So I won't dwell much into this, but as we can see on the presentation, there's the NA Rules Committee, the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs, there's also the Executive Authority, and so on. And then the next slide will just be to indicate Parliament's response to date. So according to the plan, the recommendations were forwarded to the appropriate committees in both houses. The three rules committees, the NA, the NCOP, as well as the joint rules committees, were expected to play a leading role in processing the recommendations, particularly those relating to parliamentary oversight and accountability. So progress reports on recommendations that relate directly to the mandates of these rules, the three rules committee, were to be submitted to the NA Speaker and the NCOP chairperson every 6 months. And then beyond these three rules committees, there were also 22 other committees identified to oversee the implementation plan of the president in response to the Commission's recommendations. So we note that Parliament's response to the State Capture Commission's recommendation is two-pronged. So there's on one hand, there's a response to the recommendations on Parliament's functioning, oversight function and accountability function. And then on the other hand, it's a response to the recommendations to the executive, which are addressed in President Ramaphosa's implementation plan that was sent to Parliament in October 2022. So this is just a pie chart which gives an overview of what has been done to date in relation to the 19 recommendations that are specifically related to Parliament's work. So as we can note, as illustrated, of the 19 recommendations, 11 have been addressed and 8 are still being processed. So this is the information that we have at hand from our research, as well as from the update that was the Speaker of the NA published on 26 June, 2 months back. So we also will note that most of the progress we have witnessed so far in dealing with the Commission's recommendations has happened in the second parliamentary term, that is from April to June. And Parliament, as we are aware, might be aware, is currently on recess, and they are returning at the end of August. So hopefully, the moment they are back, they might commence with processing some of the recommendations that are outstanding. Yes, and then we also highlight the work that the Portfolio Committee on Ethics and Members' Interest has done. So this committee is not part of those structures that are processing the 10 key recommendations and the 19 disaggregated, but it dealt with the breaching of the ethics code by current MPs as a result of the revelations at the Zondo Commission inquiry. So this flowed from Parliament's Legal Division, which recommended in May last year that the Ethics Committee consider whether certain MPs had breached the ethics code. So a total of 12 MPs that were implicated in the report have at this stage they've been implicated at the inquiry. Of those 12, 3 were found guilty of violating the ethics code, and this would include former Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane. And then 5 MPs that include Parliament's chairperson, House chairperson of committees, Cedric Frolick, were cleared, and 2 others remain under investigation. We also got an update from Speaker Mapisa Nqakula that at least 2 MPs have since resigned from Parliament, and so they fall outside the scope of the application of the ethics code. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, we highlight how Parliament is overseeing the President's response plan. So the President's response plan focuses on the recommendations that are directed to the executive and those that affect its work. I think Gary gave a block-by-block count of some of these those recommendations. So in line with this, 22 committees were signed to oversee executive action regarding the recommendations. So the specific matters that they will be overseeing will include criminal investigations and prosecutions, asset recoveries, reforms to prevent future occurrences of state capture, and also broader systemic reforms to ensure that there won't be another state capture in the foreseeable future. So the commission, all in all, made 205 recommendations on the criminal investigation and possible prosecution of people and companies implicated. So Parliament will have to oversee all the processes relating to the implementation of those. So all in all, from what we've uncovered so far, many committees have not done much work in relation to this in terms of monitoring or overseeing the response plans, and we cannot confirm if they met the 6-month deadline as well as the quarterly reporting deadlines that were set out in the November 2022 implementation plan. And then we just have some concluding thoughts around Parliament's processing of the Commission's report so far. So we recognize as PMG that the process relating to Parliament's processing of the recommendations have only gotten underway, so it's not possible to definitively make an assessment around their impacts so far. But however, when considering the recommendations in totality, there are some complex big issues that might take long to process. But also, there are also a number of small quick wins that committees might do well to implement and put into place independently. So while much work from November 2022 to date has been done in terms of identifying the structures that will be processing the various recommendations, the reporting mechanisms and other procedural considerations, our overall sense as PMG is that the implementation has been more or less a tick box exercise and a missed opportunity in many respects. So broadly speaking, also reflecting on the oversight and accountability mandate, Parliament's performance has been a mixed bag. So we illustrate that by way of a few examples. On one hand will be Parliament's mass decision to reject the independence panel report on the Phala matter, which was widely criticized and viewed as another example of oversight failure. But on the opposite end, we also highlight that there's been much progress in terms of Parliament's approach in dealing with issues around Eskom investigations. When the Thabo Bester matter, when Parliament was made aware about the Thabo Bester issue, they were quite proactive in terms of processing that and scheduling hearings around that. So we recognize that while there are pockets of progress and excellence, when Parliament fails on the big matters, it overshadows the good work that is being done. So we believe civil society, we need to be very vigilant and be a vocal voice in supporting effective oversight throughout the accountability chain. So there's an opportunity with the 7th Parliament next year to reimagine and reinvigorate the institution through the work of civil society and all people involved and all parties involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sabelo. Again, perhaps not quite as optimistic, not as many ticks as Gary had in his presentation. And as you say, Parliament has taken a very long time to start to get to grips with some of these things. And one of the concerns would be that as we do move towards the elections next year, a lot of these little projects that this Parliament is busy with could fall off the table and then take quite a long time to be picked up again after the elections. With that, I'm going to hand over then to our parliamentary insider, Steve Swart, for your response to what you've heard this morning. Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. And again, on behalf of the African Christian Democratic Party, thank you so much for the invitation. We just commend you and, of course, the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office for the incredible work and the wonderful relationship that we've had with you for over many years, your inputs in Parliament. And, of course, thank you to my dear friend, Advocate Gary Pienaar and Sabella Ndlovu for your insightful and comprehensive evaluation of the Commission, the recommendations, the findings. I think it's very important for us to say up front that Zondo laid the blame for state capture squarely at the ANC, given its more than 50% majority that it enjoys in Parliament. And Parliament could have done far much more. We did some of the work, as was pointed out in the Eskom inquiry, but far more needs to be done. And one's got to remember, in the previous Parliament, the Nkandla Constitutional Court judgment, which found that then President Zuma had breached his constitutional duty in not implementing the public protector's findings, but Parliament itself had breached its constitutional duties in not exercising oversight of the executive. So you would have thought that following that judgment and now following the Zondo Commission's recommendations, that far more would have been done to implement those recommendations by Parliament. And yes, some progress has been made. I think far much more been done. I think it's sad that the initial response of Parliament when the chief to attack the Chief Justice, the Speaker should rather have said some progress has been made, but a lot still needs to be done. And of course, one of the main challenges, as pointed out, is the issue of cadre deployment, where instructions are received from the Thuli House. That clearly undermines the role of Parliament as an institution. The issue was raised, I think, by Sabelo about the Phala report, where we had an esteemed panel of experts led by former Chief Justice Sandile Ngobo, who came out and said the president has a case to answer. And what did the ANC majority in Parliament do? They refused to let that go any further and basically failed to exercise oversight. And I think that is a really sad indictment of Parliament. So, of course, as we know, at the heart of oversight is Section 55, which sets out our power and obligation of Parliament to hold the President and the executive authority accountable. Now, my colleagues and panelists have pointed out a number of the issues already that have been highlighted or that the Zondo Commission recommended. And of course, I might have to repeat a few of those issues. I know time is limited, but I think one of the key aspects related to the Zondo Commission was the failure of executive ministers to attend portfolio committees, to attend parliamentary question times, and of course, problems continue in that regard. You cannot hold the executive to account when they do not attend portfolio committees or answer questions. And I don't want to speak across the board. There are many ministers that do attend the Justice Committee. The ministers, deputy ministers attend frequently, and we are able to exercise our oversight efficiently, but that is not across the board. Of course, we also saw the legislation on electoral reform. The Electoral Amendment Bill goes nowhere near what the Zondo Commission recommended. Possibility of a constituency-based system, directly electing the president, and of course, the important aspect of protecting members of parliament duties reasonably and in good faith. What we saw with the highlight in my political career, the Eskom inquiry by the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises in the previous Parliament. In fact, to oversight. That evidence went across to the Zondo Commission, to the ANC MPs involved. Honorable Dorothy Ranto, she was not re-elected. She, in fact, gave evidence to the Zondo Commission. So we see the need for that. And unfortunately, that was not dealt with at all. My colleagues have pointed out to a number of the issues that the NA Rules Committee is at the moment. The exercise of a designated portfolio committee of the presidency. That does not yet exist. Yes, there's been an overseas study tour, but there are a number of issues that need to be reconsidered in that regard. The ethics of members' interests. After everything, former Minister Zwane was found guilty and reprimanded. I mean, that was at the heart of the Eskom inquiry, the heart of what we saw of the state capture at the Eskom. So I think when one looks further into the issues of the deficiency in the portfolio committees, I've spoken to the Speaker and I've said, when we had that Eskom inquiry by the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee, and when the Justice Committee quickly had the Thabo Best inquiry, these were lengthy inquiries. The Eskom inquiry was 18 months, and we were given an opportunity as members of parliament to dig deep. Each one was given an hour to interrogate aspects and interrogate witnesses. This is an effective measure of parliamentary oversight. You can't have these very short meetings where you cannot get to the heart of the matters. Sadly, portfolio committees continue to rubber stamp the executive. And we see right now as we sit, the portfolio committee on basic education is dealing with the Basic Education Law Amendment Bill, the Bella Bill. It is very contentious. Members of the opposition have been silenced. Our ACDP member has been silenced, and they're busy doing a clause-by-clause deliberations. This is totally unacceptable, and again, is an indication of rubber stamping the executive. So I think the question of procurement reform, obviously, I think that is at the heart again, that at the heart of the fraud at Eskom, Transnet, the now SAA. These were hollowed out, and it's dealt with. There's 124 pages of the report, but sadly, the public procurement bill before the Finance Committee, as Advocate Pienaar pointed out, is not sufficient and doesn't follow what the academics that were tasked and helped draft the bill, doesn't incorporate a lot of what we said. So we'll be watching that aspect very, very carefully. So just to wind up, because I know that you still would want to have some time with questioning, just on the issue of the criminal justice setup. Yes, we've seen the MPA amendment bill, but the question is, will we have sufficient time to deal with these urgent pieces of legislation? At the moment, there's almost a 2-month constituency period. A number of portfolio committees are sitting, but it seems that the majority party in particular is gearing itself more and more to contest the elections next year, given the fact that there's a high probability of them getting below 50%. And a lot of these urgent issues are not going to be dealt with. The 22 committees are definitely not going to finalize recommendations on the Zondo Commission report. And we sadly are seeing, whilst there are some green shoots, we sadly seeing still the instructions from the Thuli House as to how MPs must vote. We saw that with the Phala voting in Parliament. Thankfully, 1 or 2 MPs, cabinet ministers, did vote against the party line, and they've been fired basically. So there isn't that sufficient protection. I think from our perspective in the Justice Committee as well, the need to protect whistleblowers, the discussion paper, those are very welcome. And of course, the establishment of a Scorpions-like unit. I said at the time the Scorpions were disbanded, the only reason why it is being disbanded is because it is so effective in prosecuting politicians. And that is why they were disbanded. So many, many years later, they're trying to reestablish that. But I share Gary's concerns about the Glenister judgment not being complied with when it comes to those STIRS criteria. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So, Mike, I think to conclude, Gary said, people of character, people appointed and elected in society. It's a question of ethics and morality. I think that is such a key to the heart of the issue. But I just want to end off by saying that a highlight was that Eskom inquiry, 18 months, yes, whilst a lot of those recommendations of that parliamentary Eskom inquiry were not implemented, at least the evidence that parliamentarians gained, and the evidence that we gained also in this Thabo Bester inquiry, will stand us in good stead. And that evidence went across to the Zondo Commission, and it itself, whilst there's a lot of deficiencies in Parliament, the Commission said this was one portfolio committee that really exercised its oversight function correctly. And in fact, that portfolio committee won an award to conclude by saying there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but there are some green shoots that we can be grateful for. And of course, we've got elections in 2024 when the majority party can be accountable for the state of our nation. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Steve. You broke up, unfortunately, slightly towards the end, but we certainly got the gist of what you were saying. And I think we must acknowledge also that, as you say, the Justice Committee is one of those that has really tried, perhaps more than almost all the others over the years, to carry out its oversight function. And it's always been staffed by some of the stronger MPs, I think, in Parliament from across the different political parties. So Gary, Sabelo, Steve, thank you very much. Steve, as always, we appreciate your readiness to join us. We know how busy MPs are, yourself in particular. Members of the Justice Committee always have a lot on their plates. So we appreciate you taking time this morning. We've heard what you've said about us as civil society putting pressure on the politicians. We certainly will find ways of doing that. Everybody, thank you for your participation in this. Much appreciated.